poor girl inherits Millionaire mansion, but she never imagined what awaited her there. It was a winter morning in Velmor, and the overcast sky cast a palette of grays over the city. A cold breeze slithered through the narrow streets as if trying to drive away any warmth that dared to approach. Marina stood in front of the enormous iron gates of the mansion, hesitant yet fascinated. In her hands, she held a timeworn, yellowed envelope with her name inscribed in handwriting that appeared both old and elegant. This letter was her only link to the place, an unexpected letter announcing an inheritance from a distant relative she'd never known existed. The mansion, known as the Ornato House, was imposing, almost intimidating. Its walls were made of dark stone, and the windows, veiled with worn, dusty curtains, seemed to gaze back at Marina like watchful, suspicious eyes. Every detail of the facade was covered by a fine layer of moss, clinging to the stones like memories that refused to fade. Marina took a deep breath and pushed open the gate, which creaked in protest, revealing a garden that seemed untouched for years. The grass was overgrown, mingling with weeds and dead flowers, and the stone path leading to the main entrance was partially hidden by the thick undergrowth. Marina felt a chill run down her spine as she walked, as if the very ground of the mansion was recalling dark times. With each step, she felt the weight of the place's history enveloping her mind. She had lost everything so quickly and brutally that the invitation to inherit felt like a last stroke of luck. But at the same time, something about Ornato House felt as if it was hiding something from her, waiting for a secret to be uncovered. As she reached the door, Marina hesitated. The rusty hinges gave small groans with every touch, and the silence that took over the atmosphere seemed almost suffocating. Gathering her courage, she turned the doorknob and pushed it open, and it swung with a long, sharp creak. Darkness welcomed her in the entry hall, and she had to blink several times to adjust to the dim light. The air inside was dense and had a peculiar smell of dampness and old dust, as if no one had set foot there in decades. The furniture was covered in white sheets, creating ghostly silhouettes under the faint light seeping through the dusty windows. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, Marina began to make out details of the room. Old portraits, framed in faded gold, hung on the walls, displaying serious and mysterious faces. They seemed to watch her as if they were the true guardians of the place. "Who were you?" she whispered to the portraits, trying to imagine the stories of those distant faces. Her voice echoed through the halls, and for a moment, she had the sense that she wasn't alone. Her hands trembled slightly, but she continued to explore, pulling sheets from some of the furniture. She uncovered an antique red velvet armchair, a dark leather sofa, and an immense fireplace that appeared untouched for years. There was also a small wooden table beside the armchair, where a melted candle lay, surrounded by a thin layer of dust. It was a scene from another era, frozen at some point in time. Marina remembered the lawyer who had handed her the mansion's key and the letter from her unknown relative, mentioning that there were no records on the family. All she knew was that someone had decided the property belonged to her, for reasons he couldn't explain. She felt that, beyond the cold walls and covered furniture, there were secrets waiting for her to uncover. With her heart pounding, Marina climbed the main staircase, the steps creaking beneath her feet. At the end of the hall, she found a door slightly ajar. When she pushed it open, she realized the room was large, with a canopy bed covered by dusty, torn fabric. At the head of the bed sat a locked chest with a robust-looking lock. Marina couldn't resist trying to open it, but it was locked, which only piqued her curiosity further. She sat on the bed, feeling the mattress sink slightly. Looking around, she noticed an old desk near the window, with a stack of papers and a closed diary. The page edges were yellowed, and the letters on the cover were almost illegible. With trembling hands, she opened it and began to leaf through the first pages, where careful handwriting detailed events from the past. The opening lines spoke of a powerful family that had occupied the mansion many years ago. They were described as aristocrats of strict temperament, who prized lineage above all else. As she read, Marina became lost in the stories, until a specific passage caught her attention. It was a letter written by someone who seemed deeply disappointed in one of the heirs. "My dear Gabriel," she read aloud, and a shiver ran down her spine. The letter was vague, but the tone of contempt was clear. The author mentioned an irreparable error, its betrayal of blood, and an unworthy heir. Marina felt a mix of confusion and fascination. Who was Gabriel? And what was this error that had cost him his right to the mansion? She continued reading, but the following lines were faded, illegible, as if time itself had intentionally erased those words. Yet Gabriel's name echoed in her mind, stirring an unsettling curiosity. It was clear that the mansion held more secrets than she had imagined. Lost in thought, Marina decided she would investigate to the end. She felt driven to understand who these people were and how Gabriel's name fit into her story. She descended the stairs again, looking around as though the portraits on the walls were watching her. Something in the house seemed to wake with her presence, as if it had long awaited someone willing to listen to the untold stories of its family. When she reached the entry hall, she looked at the half-open door, feeling that crossing it would completely change her life. And somehow, Marina knew she was ready for it. The day was already ending when Marina found herself entirely enveloped by curiosity. The shadows around her within the mansion seemed to lengthen by the minute, dancing on the walls like ancestral figures carrying ancient secrets. This world was far removed from any other she had known, yet Marina felt an intense, almost visceral connection to it all. She returned to the room where she had found the first letter. The diary, resting open on the desk, seemed to charge her with uncovering whatever time had let slip. The words written there sounded like whispers from the past, calling her to learn the hidden truth of the house. Marina ran her fingers over the delicate pages, and though many were illegible, some passages remained intact, as if waiting just for her. A family is more than blood. It is a commitment to our values and our name. Whoever dares to break this pact shall renounce not only the inheritance but the right to be called one of the Ornatos. The writing was authoritarian and inflexible. Each sentence carried the severity of someone who believed in honor and tradition over affection and compassion. Marina sighed. She thought of the sacrifices people often made to uphold family pride, wondering how many had lived here not for love but out of duty. Something in that atmosphere of rigidity and disapproval resonated with her deeply, reminding her of her own struggles to find a home and a dignified life. She continued to search the room, and in a side drawer of the desk, she found a small wooden box with a simple, rusty lock. The lid creaked as it opened, revealing a bundle of carefully organized letters tied with a faded satin ribbon. Marina pulled them out cautiously, trying not to damage the old paper, and began reading the names on the envelopes. Gabriel Ornato read the first envelope, in firm, neatly drawn letters. The name made her heart race once more. Gabriel, the same name mentioned with such disdain and disappointment in the earlier letter. Could he be the disowned heir? All the letters were addressed to Gabriel, written by an anonymous sender who seemed to harbor conflicting feelings toward him. Some letters offered subtle praise and words of encouragement, others harsh criticism of his conduct and choices. Marina began reading one letter more closely. "My dear Gabriel, if only you could understand the weight of every choice you make. There is no honor in following paths that stray from our lineage, and every step away from our roots is a step closer to being lost. The mansion and all it represents depend on your commitment to our heritage." Marina read the words more than once. With each sentence, she realized that the Ornato family saw Gabriel as someone who didn't live up to their expectations. He was viewed as a renegade, someone who had strayed from what the family deemed worthy. It was painful, but it also felt familiar to Marina, who had often been judged for following unconventional paths. This Gabriel was beginning to stir her empathy. Who was he? And what mistake could be so serious that it cost him his own home? As she continued leafing through the letters, Marina noticed some words were smeared, as if written with anger and tears. In one of the letters, she found a final message, more direct and menacing. "There is no place for renegades in the house of the Ornatos. Let your error be your legacy, and may the whispers of your betrayal follow you forever." Those words echoed in Marina's mind, almost like a curse. The tension and severity of the sentence sent a chill down her spine. She imagined Gabriel, perhaps a young and dreamy man, trapped between the expectations of an inflexible lineage and his own desire for freedom. The weight of being an Ornato seemed stifling, and Marina began to understand that maybe Gabriel hadn't chosen this fate, perhaps he had been pushed into it. As she reread the letters, a final page slipped from the box and fell softly to the floor. It was a different letter, brief and written in fine, almost delicate handwriting, unlike the others. She picked it up and began reading it in a low voice. For those who see with their hearts, the Ornato mansion is more than an inheritance. It is a burden of loves and hatreds that many could not bear. And yet, for those who dare to love beyond the rules, there will always be redemption. Those words seemed to illuminate the room. Marina looked around, sensing a new meaning in the place where she stood. The mansion, which had once felt cold and oppressive, now had a touch of fragility, as if it were a sanctuary waiting to be understood. The feeling of connection grew stronger. It was as if that letter had been written for her, someone who was also searching for a sense of belonging, even if it came laden with conflict. In that moment, Marina felt an urge to continue her search. She wanted more than ever to know who Gabriel had been and what had really happened in this house. As the hours passed, night fell slowly, wrapping the mansion in even denser shadows. Marina lit an old candle she found on the table and continued exploring the room, where fragments of family history seemed hidden in every corner. Moving a small trunk aside to see what lay behind it, she discovered a narrow, dark passage partially covered by a faded tapestry. It was a discreet door, almost unnoticeable, likely overlooked by anyone less observant. With a flickering candle in hand, Marina opened the door, revealing a spiral staircase that descended into an obscure space. Her footsteps echoed as she cautiously made her way down, observing the cold, damp walls around her. At the bottom of the stairs, she found a small, stuffy room with a collection of objects covered by cloths and old boxes. Inside, she found a portrait of Gabriel. He was young, with an intense and melancholic gaze, wearing an expression that seemed to contain countless untold stories. The painting showed a man in conflict, someone who didn't seem to completely belong to the Ornato world. Marina felt a growing empathy for him, as if her own struggles and search for a place to belong mirrored something Gabriel had also felt. Holding the candle, she looked around and realized this room was a sort of private sanctuary, perhaps a refuge for Gabriel or another family member. The room bore signs of human presence. A worn chair, a table with small personal items, and an old, dusty piano that hadn't been played in years. Marina sat in the chair and closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing the energy of the space. She felt watched but not frightened. It was as if the stories of this place were whispering in her ears, waiting to be heard once more. With each step, Marina drew closer to the mystery of the mansion and the enigmatic Gabriel. The day dawned with a thick fog that blanketed the mansion grounds, giving the place an even more ghostly atmosphere. Marina had spent most of the night awake, her thoughts filled with Gabriel's portrait and the letters that, in a way, told of his life and loss. Deep down, she knew this was just the beginning of a much more complex story. Still reflecting on the previous night's discoveries, she descended to the hall and gazed out at the garden through the window. The misty scene made each corner of the house appear darker and more filled with secrets. Marina wondered what Gabriel would be like now if he still bore the intense expression from the portrait she'd found in the hidden room. But she didn't have much time to wonder. The sound of an engine, distant and persistent, echoed from outside. The silhouette of a black car cut through the mist, advancing along the narrow road leading up to the mansion entrance. Marina's heart began to race. She hadn't been expecting visitors, and in the isolation of this house, any unknown presence felt like an omen of something important. With a mixture of curiosity and unease, she watched as the car parked, and a tall man, with a firm stance, stepped out, walking with determined steps. As the stranger approached the door, Marina felt a wave of anticipation and, at the same time, apprehension. It was as if she were about to meet someone crucial to the mansion's mystery, someone who might hold the answers she sought. She took a deep breath and walked to the door, only to be surprised by the forceful ring of the doorbell, which echoed almost imposingly through the hall. When she opened the door, she was met by an elegant man with an expression clouded by impatience and disdain. He looked her up and down, his face marked with a look of disapproval at what he saw. Without waiting for a greeting, he stepped into the mansion, casting a reproving look around the space. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone more of a demand than a question. Marina lifted her chin, feeling uncomfortable under his gaze, yet also driven to protect the little she had. After all, this was now her home, even if only temporarily. "I should be the one asking you that, since you barged into my house uninvited," she replied, with a firmness that even surprised herself. The man narrowed his eyes, seeming to weigh her every word. It was clear he hadn't expected resistance. Marina sensed that this was a man used to having everything his way, someone who dominated any space simply with his presence. After a tense silence, he finally introduced himself. "Gabriel Ornato," he said, with almost theatrical emphasis on his name, as though it were a title, something he believed could silence any question. The name echoed within Marina like thunder. It was him. The Gabriel from the portrait, the lost heir, the renegade man mentioned in the letters. She felt a whirlwind of emotions but kept her calm, aware that every word would be a key part of this first standoff. "Marina," she said, simply and directly. "Heir to the house of Ornatos." Gabriel raised an eyebrow, a slight, almost mocking smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Heir?" He laughed, a cold sound full of disdain. "This must be some kind of joke. This place belongs to me and always has. It's a matter of blood, of tradition. Whoever put you here surely made a mistake." Marina didn't let his words faze her. She met his gaze with steady resolve. Although he was imposing, she held her ground, sensing that this was her first test, a moment to show she wasn't merely an intruder. "Look, Gabriel, I have legal documents that confirm my inheritance. It might be hard for you to accept, but I belong to this house now as much as you do. And as long as I'm here, I will honor what I received, even if that bothers you." Gabriel took a few steps around the hall, scrutinizing every detail as though the mansion were an old acquaintance he hadn't seen in a long time. There was something melancholy in his gaze as he ran his fingers along the wall, as though he were touching a forgotten memory. But before Marina could make sense of this fragile moment, he turned back to her with a look of irritation. "Honor? You think you understand what this house means?" His voice was full of scorn. "Spending a night here and reading a few old letters doesn't give you the right to use words like honor. You don't know anything about what it means to be an Ornato." Marina felt indignation boiling inside her. Each of Gabriel's words was an attempt to diminish her presence, to make her feel like an outsider. However, she couldn't ignore the truth. He, too, carried the history of this place, and the letters she'd read the night before showed that he had indeed been shut out of his own home. It was clear there was a conflict between Gabriel and the mansion, a battle he seemed to carry in every fiber of his being. She took a deep breath and maintained her firm tone. "Maybe I don't know everything about this house, Gabriel, but from what I've discovered, it seems there are more secrets here than you'd like to admit. The mansion is filled with letters, with memories that haven't been erased, waiting for someone brave enough to confront them." Gabriel was silent for a moment, his eyes narrowing in distrust. "You don't understand. This mansion isn't just an old building. It's a burden, a responsibility only someone with the name Ornato can bear. And why do you think my name doesn't count?" Marina shot back, determined. "I'm not here to steal anything from you, Gabriel. If I'm here, it's because life has brought me to this point, and this inheritance is all I have left. Unlike you, I am willing to face what this house represents." Gabriel looked at her with a hard gaze, but something in his expression softened for a moment, as if, for a brief second, he saw something in Marina that made him reconsider his judgment. However, the moment passed too quickly, and he resumed his guarded, cold mask. "We'll see how long you last," he said, crossing his arms in a challenging stance. "This house is more than you imagine. And if you think you can bear its weight, you'll have to prove it." Without waiting for a response, Gabriel began walking around the mansion, inspecting every corner like an inspector, but also with a familiar, nostalgic gaze. Marina followed him from a distance, not entirely understanding what he was looking for, yet feeling compelled to find out. Gabriel seemed distant, lost in memories he wasn't willing to share easily, and the air of mystery surrounding him only strengthened Marina's determination to understand the story. The tension between them was almost palpable, and Marina knew this was only the beginning of a long journey with Gabriel. The Ornato mansion wasn't just a place, it was a tangled web of memories, secrets, and resentments, and now she stood at the heart of it all. Marina watched as Gabriel strode through the mansion's halls with almost irritated steps. Each movement seemed a silent protest against her presence there. His gaze, sometimes inspecting the dusty walls and furniture, sometimes fixating on her with cold disdain, made it clear he considered this place rightfully his. With each passing minute, the tension between them grew thicker, as if the very mansion absorbed the resentment and conflict. But Marina remained resolute. Determined not to let herself be intimidated, she followed him, ready to show that, despite his arrogance, he wouldn't unsettle her. In truth, she was beginning to realize that his haughty facade hid something deeper, something Gabriel seemed determined to hide from everyone, including himself. Finally, after minutes of uncomfortable silence, Gabriel stopped before one of the large windows overlooking the garden. He looked at the view for a moment before speaking, still without turning to Marina. "You don't understand anything about this house and what it represents, Marina," he said, his voice sounding like a cold, hard sentence. "Do you think just because you found some old papers and read a few letters, you understand what it means to be an Ornato?" She took a deep breath, resisting the urge to roll her eyes. He spoke as if she were a naive child, as though only he could bear the weight of this story. But Marina knew she couldn't show weakness, not to someone who clearly saw her as an intruder. "And what do you think it means to be an Ornato, Gabriel?" she countered, keeping her tone firm. "Because, from what I've read, being part of this family seems more like a burden than a blessing." Gabriel finally looked at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and irritation. Marina knew he expected her to feel inferior or, at the very least, to back down at his words. But she wouldn't yield. "A burden?" He laughed, a short, bitter laugh. "That's the perspective of someone who's never had anything, who doesn't understand the weight of a name, of a history. Being an Ornato is more than you could comprehend, Marina. It's a commitment, a pact with those who came before us." Marina met his gaze with seriousness, not looking away. She felt a mixture of curiosity and indignation at the way he spoke, as if her own suffering and right to be there were insignificant compared to what he called commitment and pact. But she wouldn't retreat. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I don't fully understand what it means to be an Ornato," she admitted, crossing her arms. "But I know what it's like to fight for something when you have nothing. I know what it's like to lose everything and suddenly find a thread of hope, even if it comes with secrets and mysteries. And you, Gabriel, seem so bound to this history that you can't even see what really matters." He looked at her intently, as if trying to decipher every word she had said. Gabriel's eyes, though filled with arrogance, also revealed something deeper, a shadow of sadness and pain he carefully hid. Marina sensed that beneath his layers of contempt and pride was someone who had perhaps lost more than she had initially realized. But before she could say anything else, he stepped closer, his face now mere inches from hers. His gaze was intense, cold, and Marina felt her heart race, though she refused to show any sign of fear. "Do you think you're the first person to try to understand what it's like to live in this house? Do you really believe that reading a few letters will give you the answers I've spent my life searching for?" His words were a challenge, yet Marina sensed there was something more, a desperate need to be understood. She took a deep breath, searching for words that might reach beyond the wall he'd built around himself. "I don't think I'll find all the answers, Gabriel. But I do know that I'm going to try to understand. I'm going to listen to every story this house has to tell, even if you prefer to ignore them. If this bothers you so much, maybe it's because you're also searching for something here. And unlike you, I'm not running away." Gabriel stepped back slightly, as if her words had struck a sensitive spot. His expression flickered, revealing a brief hint of vulnerability before he restored his mask of indifference. "Running away?" He laughed, but his tone betrayed a touch of the insecurity he was trying to hide. You don't know anything about me, Marina. And frankly, the less you know, the better it will be for you. She took a step forward, determined to show him she wouldn't back down, even in the face of his intensity. There was something about Gabriel that intrigued her, something she knew she'd have to confront if she truly wanted to understand the history of this mansion. Maybe I don't know anything about you, Gabriel, she said, her voice calm but full of conviction. But that doesn't stop me from trying to understand. Because unlike you, I'm willing to face whatever is hidden in this place. He stared at her, and Marina realized that, even if he didn't want to admit it, Gabriel was being challenged in a way he might never have been before. Perhaps that was why he reacted with such disdain and arrogance. Perhaps he feared what this house and its history might reveal about himself. A heavy silence fell between them, and for a moment, Marina had the impression that Gabriel was preparing to say something more, something that might reveal a bit of the truth he kept hidden. But he held back, taking a deep breath and diverting his gaze to the dark walls of the mansion. Do as you please, Marina. Search every corner, read every letter you find. But don't expect to find anything other than shadows and regrets, he said, turning to leave the hall. This house was built on secrets and lies. And if you think you're going to find a happy ending, you're more mistaken than I imagined. With those words, Gabriel walked out through the main door, leaving Marina alone in the hall. The sound of his footsteps fading away echoed like a final warning that the Ornato mansion held much more than she could comprehend. Marina stood there, absorbing each word he'd said. Something about the way he spoke revealed that Gabriel wasn't just an arrogant heir. He was someone deeply scarred by these walls and the stories that inhabited this place. She knew that her presence here was stirring something deep within him, something he was desperately trying to keep buried. With the hall now silent, Marina looked around, feeling once again the dark and enigmatic presence of the mansion. Gabriel had made it clear that she wasn't welcome here, but Marina felt that her purpose went beyond any approval. She needed to understand this house, every letter, every shadow, every fragment of history she could uncover. If he was so determined to drive her away, it was because the truth hidden here was too great to ignore. Marina took a deep breath, prepared to continue, even if it meant facing the darkest secrets of the Ornatos. Marina stared down the dark corridor in front of her, illuminated only by the faint light filtering through the dusty windows. After her intense conversation with Gabriel, she felt the weight of the challenge ahead. He had made his contempt clear and his intention to make her abandon the place. Yet, the stronger he resisted facing the past, the greater Marina's determination grew. It was almost as if the mansion itself were calling to her, wanting someone to finally uncover its secrets. A few hours passed until she once again heard footsteps echoing through the hall. Gabriel was back. He walked toward Marina with a serious expression, maintaining a composed stance. But something in his gaze suggested he had also reflected on what he'd said before leaving. He didn't look pleased to see her still there. You haven't given up yet? He asked, with a hint of sarcasm. Marina held his gaze, keeping her calm. If there's one thing this mansion has taught me, Gabriel, it's that there's no point in running. There are too many secrets here, and I'll do whatever it takes to uncover what really happened. Gabriel looked at her in silence, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He crossed his arms, clearly reluctant, but something seemed to be shifting. Perhaps, in some way, he too felt the need to confront the past. Then let's settle this once and for all, Marina, he said, his tone a mix of skepticism and challenge. But don't think this means you have any right to be here. I just want to end this story. If that means searching the house alongside you, so be it. Let's find out what this mansion has to say. Despite Gabriel's tone, Marina sensed he was willing to cooperate. It was the most she could expect from him for now, and she accepted without hesitation. Together, they began exploring the mansion's first floor, each carrying a flashlight that cast beams across the old walls and dusty furniture. As they walked through the corridors, the heavy atmosphere of the mansion felt even more palpable. Marina shivered each time her eyes landed on an old portrait or worn furniture, as though each object told a story, each wall held a secret. In one of the rooms, they found a bookshelf filled with dusty books, all with ancient bindings and titles embossed in now-faded gold letters. Marina picked up one of the books and flipped through its pages, inhaling the scent of old paper. Most were diaries and historical records from members of the Ornato family, some written in languages she barely recognized. Gabriel, meanwhile, seemed uncomfortable with the discovery. He kept a tense expression, as if the pages of the books were something he'd rather ignore. Marina noticed his discomfort but chose to break the silence. "Are these family diaries?" she asked, trying to draw him into the investigation. He nodded, his eyes fixed on a distant point. "Yes, they're records of the Ornato lineage, written by family members over the years. My grandfather took great care in maintaining this library, but I suppose it doesn't matter anymore." He averted his gaze, almost regretful for sharing that. Marina, however, felt it was the right moment to press him further. "Maybe it matters more than you think, Gabriel. You said the mansion is a burden, but it seems there's a lot here that you haven't faced. Don't you think it's time to understand what really happened with your family?" Gabriel looked at her, and for a moment he seemed to consider her words. His eyes showed a mix of anguish and frustration, as though he was battling something within himself. Finally, he picked up one of the diaries and began leafing through it. "These diaries," he murmured, his voice tinged with melancholy. "They talk about sacrifices and choices many of the Ornatos made. My grandfather, he believed that each of us had a role to fulfill, that our duty was to protect the family name above all else." "And you?" Marina asked gently. "What do you think of that?" Gabriel hesitated before answering, as though the words were hard to admit. "I think it's a prison. All these records, these memories, they're like chains that bind us to a past that never lets us go. That's why I always wanted to keep my distance from this place, but it seems this house always finds a way to pull me back." Marina watched his expression as he spoke, and in that moment, she saw the man behind the arrogant facade. He wasn't just an angry heir, he was someone burdened by expectations and responsibilities he'd never wanted. Something about the way he spoke stirred her empathy. "Maybe you need to face these secrets just as much as I do, Gabriel," she said gently. "Maybe the only way to find peace is by understanding what really happened here." Gabriel looked at her seriously, and for a moment, Marina saw a slight hint of gratitude in his eyes. But he quickly dismissed it, returning to his defensive posture. "I don't need your sympathy, Marina. If you're so eager to uncover what this mansion hides, go ahead. But don't expect me to share in your hopes." She nodded, understanding that he still wasn't ready to fully open up. However, she knew she had taken an important step by convincing him to investigate by her side. Together, they continued exploring the rooms and corridors, searching for more clues. In one of the side rooms, Marina found an old wooden box on a high shelf. When she opened it, she discovered a series of letters, carefully folded, all addressed to Gabriel Ornato. She shivered, realizing these might be letters from a close relative. She handed the box to Gabriel, who took it with a cautious expression, as if the contents were ghosts from the past. He opened the first letter and read the words silently, his eyes moving slowly over the paper. After a few moments, he spoke, his voice low and restrained. "This letter is from my mother," he said, and Marina noticed the pain in his tone. "She wrote these words shortly before she left. She always said that this house was meant for those who had the courage to face it. Maybe I was never brave enough." Marina didn't say anything but sensed that this was a deeply important moment for Gabriel. For the first time, he was confronting a part of the past he had long avoided. And although he wouldn't admit it, Marina knew her presence here had an influence, a force that urged him to face what he had once pushed aside. "Maybe courage means facing the truth, even when it's painful, Gabriel. And maybe this house needs more than just memories," she said gently. "Maybe it needs someone willing to transform it." Gabriel looked at her with a mix of surprise and reflection. He seemed to consider her words as if, in some way, he was finally understanding that Marina wasn't a threat. Perhaps she was, in fact, the key to unlocking the secrets of Ornato House, something he had never been able to do alone. The silence that fell between them was heavy, but no longer hostile. It was as if they both were slowly realizing that the path they were now following was a shared one. And, although reluctant, Gabriel was beginning to allow Marina to see a side of him that he didn't fully understand himself. Together, they moved on to another room, walking with a calmer pace and a silent understanding. The mansion, once dark and hostile, now seemed more welcoming, as if it had been waiting for this moment of reconciliation between the past and the present, between the heir and the intruder. The corridors of Ornato House remained in a perpetual shadow, as though sunlight, for some inexplicable reason, never fully reached within. Marina and Gabriel continued exploring the rooms, each holding traces of a past they were far from fully understanding. Yet something was beginning to shift. The silence between them was no longer one of confrontation but one of shared curiosity, a tacit agreement that they both had reasons to unearth the house's secrets. As they explored a hall lined with antique mirrors, Marina noticed a chest pushed against the wall. With a curious expression, she walked over and tried to open it. The lid creaked as it lifted, revealing a collection of items that seemed to belong to someone special. There was a hardcover notebook, an old doll, and a pair of satin gloves, all dusty but arranged with a care that indicated affection. "Who did these belong to?" she asked, more to herself than to Gabriel. However, he heard the question and came closer. His face went pale for a moment, his eyes fixated on the objects as if seeing them for the first time in many years. He touched the gloves delicately, and Marina noticed a subtle change in his expression, a vulnerability he seemed to want to hide. "These things were my mother's," he replied in an almost imperceptible whisper. "She kept everything that had value to her. She was a woman who believed in the power of memories." Marina noticed his reluctance to speak about his mother, as though the memories were both a comfort and a torment to him. But this was a rare opening, a moment when Gabriel, even if just briefly, seemed willing to share a part of himself. "She must have been a strong person," Marina commented softly, trying to encourage him to open up a little more. Gabriel let out a faint sigh and looked away, torn between the desire to keep the memories to himself and the need to let someone in. His eyes returned to the objects in the chest. She was different from the other Ornatos. She never cared for the family's rigid rules, and it made her vulnerable. Gabriel paused, his voice quieter. "My mother was the only person who truly saw beyond appearances. She didn't see the world as a series of duties but as a collection of moments to be cherished." His voice trembled slightly, and Marina felt a wave of compassion. The arrogance Gabriel so proudly wore seemed to be falling away, and here was a man marked by a pain he never allowed himself to show. "I think I inherited a little of that perspective from her," Marina said, trying to ease the atmosphere. "I, too, have always tried to see the more human side of things, even when circumstances are difficult." Gabriel looked at her with an expression of almost surprise, and for a brief moment, Marina sensed a silent connection between them. She saw in his eyes something he carefully concealed, a side of him that was fragile and lonely. In that moment, Marina felt that he wasn't so different from her as he tried to appear. They continued exploring the hall, and Gabriel pointed out one of the portraits on the wall. It was a large, finely crafted painting showing a woman with a gentle gaze and graceful posture, her eyes distant but filled with compassion. "My mother," he said, gesturing toward the portrait. "She was always the soul of this house, and when she left, it felt like the mansion grew even darker." Marina moved closer to the painting, admiring the face of the woman who, in some way, seemed familiar. Perhaps it was the kindness in her gaze, or maybe it was the way Gabriel spoke of her, with a reverence and longing he showed for no one else. "Maybe the mansion needs to be seen in a new way, Gabriel," Marina suggested. "Perhaps it needs someone to bring back the vision your mother had." Gabriel seemed to reflect on her words but quickly shook his head, as if dismissing any notion of change. "The House of the Ornatos is what it is. It's a prison for those who want to escape, and a refuge for those who have no other choice. There is no new way to look at it, Marina." His voice returned to its rigid tone, as though he were protecting himself from the possibility of hope. Marina realized that Gabriel wasn't ready to see the mansion in a new light. To him, this place represented the weight of tradition, expectations, and painful memories. But she also understood that the mansion was the only link he had to his past, the only connection to his mother. Trying to ease the tension, Marina decided to change the subject and continued to sift through the items in the chest. She found a small photograph, a time-yellowed portrait of Gabriel as a young boy, standing beside his mother. He wore a shy smile, almost too shy, as though he had already learned to hide from others even at that age. "You were so young," she commented, smiling. "You look like someone who still had many hopes." Gabriel looked at the photo, and his expression grew even darker. "Hope wasn't something the house of the Ornatos allowed for long, Marina," he replied, with a restrained bitterness. "Growing up in a place like this, you learn that life is made of obligations. Hope is just an illusion." His words fell heavily on Marina, but she didn't let the sadness overwhelm her. Gabriel was trapped in his own dark view of the mansion, but she believed she could find something different here. It was as if the place, despite everything, had retained a bit of his mother's energy, something gentler and more compassionate. She stepped closer to him, determined to share a bit of her own perspective. "I believe this mansion was once more than a place of obligations, Gabriel. If your mother lived here, she brought something special. Maybe that's what needs to be reclaimed. Maybe what you're avoiding is actually what your mother most wanted to preserve." Gabriel remained silent, and Marina noticed he was torn between the urge to dismiss her words and the need to face them. It was a battle he was fighting alone, but for the first time, he seemed willing to let someone else be part of it. "I don't think I've ever considered that possibility," he murmured after a long pause. "But at the same time, I don't know if I'm ready to see this mansion in a different way." Marina nodded, understanding that this was a first step for Gabriel. He was beginning to open up, even if it was a slow and painful process. "You don't need to be ready, Gabriel. But sometimes, the best way to face what haunts us is to see the past with new eyes," she said gently. Gabriel didn't respond, but Marina sensed her words had made an impact. He looked away, taking a deep breath, as if trying to absorb what she had just said. Marina's presence was beginning to have an unexpected effect, and despite his attempts to keep his distance, he couldn't ignore her completely. In that moment, they stood in silence, looking at the items in the chest, as though these fragments of the past were also parts of who they were now. For Gabriel, it was a way to reconnect with what he had lost. For Marina, it was the start of a journey in which each memory represented a new perspective, a way to rediscover the human value behind the traditions of the Ornatos. The silence between them now was a shared silence, laden with respect and, perhaps, mutual understanding. The bonds between them, though fragile, were beginning to take shape, intertwined with memories and secrets they were both finally ready to face. The wind howled outside, and Ornato House shuddered on its old foundations, as if reacting to Marina and Gabriel's presence. They were in the main hall, where the echoes of their footsteps reverberated off walls lined with ancestral portraits. Marina was focused on a shelf filled with old objects, while Gabriel kept his distance, seemingly distracted but closely watching her movements. However, the momentary peace was interrupted by a question Marina could no longer contain. "Gabriel, why did you really come back to this mansion?" She looked at him, trying to understand if he had returned of his own will or if something else was compelling him to be there. Surprised by her directness, Gabriel held her gaze for a moment before responding, his voice low and somewhat hesitant. "Maybe I don't have a choice. To you, this house may seem like a mystery, something to be solved, but for me, it's a duty." He looked away, fixing his gaze on one of the portraits, where an ancestor looked down on him with the same stern and unyielding expression. Marina sensed there was more to his answer, something hidden that he didn't want to share. She thought for a moment before deciding to press him a bit further. "I found a series of letters from your mother, Gabriel, and one of them talks about an agreement she made with your family. Something about the continuity of the Ornatos," she said, watching every subtle change in his expression. Gabriel frowned, and though he hesitated, he ended up revealing a part of himself he had kept guarded. "That agreement my mother mentioned, it's a tradition my family has upheld for generations." His voice grew even softer, almost a whisper. Let's say I was advised to accept an arranged engagement, something my mother always wanted to preserve the Ornato name and ensure the continuation of the lineage." Marina felt torn between curiosity and indignation. Deep down, it didn't completely surprise her, yet she felt a strong aversion to the idea that Gabriel, with all his arrogance and seemingly free spirit, would submit to a loveless commitment. It wasn't so much the engagement that surprised her as Gabriel's willingness to accept it, despite all his defiance. "You're engaged?" she asked, trying to understand better. Gabriel nodded, looking away. The arrangement was made by both families. "It's a convenient union, you could say. She's from a respectable family, and the union serves every possible interest, except my own." Marina remained silent for a moment, taking in his words. The situation seemed contradictory, almost ironic. Gabriel, who so despised the expectations and traditions of the Ornatos, was now on the verge of marrying for convenience, sacrificing what she believed to be essential, the freedom to choose. "So you're marrying to satisfy some ideal of lineage?" she asked, her voice tinged with incredulity. "You, Gabriel, who speaks so much of escaping this mansion's chains, who doesn't bow to family demands, are accepting a loveless commitment?" He looked at her with irritation, and Marina realized she had struck a nerve. Visibly uncomfortable, Gabriel tried to mask the tension with a cynical smile. "Marina, you wouldn't understand. My situation is complicated. To you, it may seem like a simple choice, but for me, there's much more at stake than mere feelings." Marina felt indignation rising within her, and without holding back, she stepped closer, meeting his gaze with determination. "I may not understand all the nuances, Gabriel, but one thing is clear to me: you're wasting your life on something you don't believe in. Living a life in a loveless commitment it's surrendering to the prison you claim to despise." Her voice was laden with emotion, and as she spoke, she noticed Gabriel's irritation growing. "Maybe you're the last person who should tell me what I should or shouldn't do, Marina," he retorted, crossing his arms. "You're an intruder here, an outsider. Don't you think you're getting too involved in something that doesn't concern you?" Marina didn't back down. She knew her words unsettled Gabriel, but she also knew that, in some way, he needed to hear them. "Maybe I am an intruder, but I'm someone who sees things with a perspective you prefer to avoid. I know what it's like to live with nothing and to be forced to find meaning in the small choices I make." She held his gaze, challenging him. "If you want so badly to push me away, Gabriel, then prove you're worthy of this family you're so proud of. Prove that you're willing to fight for your freedom, instead of hiding behind obligations." Marina's words seemed to pierce Gabriel, and for a brief moment he lost control of his expression. His hardened face softened, and a slight tremble in his lips revealed the impact of her words. She realized then that he wasn't just an arrogant heir, but someone bearing hidden pain, trapped in his own choices and feelings. He looked away, taking a deep breath, as if trying to regain his composure. "You talk about freedom as if it were something simple," he murmured, almost to himself. "But in my family, Marina, freedom is a luxury few can afford." Marina felt a knot form in her throat as she heard those words. Gabriel was, indeed, caught in an internal conflict, where family duty and expectations suffocated his own desires. And though he tried to hide it, it was clear that the arranged engagement distanced him even further from who he truly was. "Maybe, Gabriel, you need to start seeing things differently," she said, her tone softer. "Your mother, the woman you speak of with such respect, perhaps she didn't want you to carry a burden like this. Maybe she left traces in this place, yes, but traces of freedom, not obligation." He looked at her, his eyes seeming to question every word Marina had said. She could see he was torn, wrestling with his own convictions. He wanted so badly to honor the Ornato name, but at the same time he seemed to be questioning the price he would have to pay for it. "And what would you do if you were in my place?" he asked, his voice a bitter whisper. Marina smiled gently, surprised by his question. "I would choose what I believe in. I'm not saying it's easy, Gabriel, but I know it's worth it. Nothing should bind us to a life that isn't truly ours." She took a deep breath, feeling that she'd finally touched on something sensitive. "Maybe it's time to choose for yourself, to understand what you really want." Gabriel seemed to absorb her words but soon shook his head, as though trying to dispel the ideas. It was as if he wasn't ready to accept it yet, as if his loyalty to his family and their expectations was stronger than his own feelings. "Choose for myself," he repeated with a bitter laugh. "Perhaps that's a luxury I was never taught to have, Marina." That moment of vulnerability lasted only a few seconds, but for Marina, it was enough. She saw that, despite his efforts to deny it, Gabriel carried within him the desire to break free from those invisible chains. Perhaps he wasn't ready yet, but she knew her words had planted a seed of doubt. As night fell, Marina felt she had taken an important step, even if a small one. Gabriel wasn't just an arrogant heir, he was someone caught between his own desires and the constraints of his lineage. And, in some way, her presence in that mansion was starting to shed light on the shadows surrounding him. Days in Velmor passed with a peculiar slowness. The mansion, shrouded in a constant, imposing mist, seemed to exist in its own time, where hours and seasons blended together. Marina was beginning to familiarize herself with every corridor, with the creak of every step, and even the sound of the old wood groaning at night, as if the mansion itself was sighing. Since the conversation about the engagement, Gabriel showed a subtle shift in his posture. He still held back, reserved and skeptical, but now he seemed to observe her with a quiet curiosity. It was as if, despite all his years of rigidity and distrust, he was beginning to accept Marina as someone capable of understanding the complexities of his life. One morning, Marina was sitting in the library, flipping through one of the old journals she had found on the shelf. They were sparse records from ancestors who had passed through the mansion, recounting the difficulties and choices each generation had to face. She lost herself in the words, imagining the lives that had been built and broken in that very place. Each line seemed to tell not just the story of a family but a legacy of decisions, renunciations, and sacrifices. As she read, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Gabriel entered the library, his gaze distant, and sat in a nearby armchair. He seemed less guarded than usual, as if something was on his mind that made him more approachable. Marina felt this might be the moment to establish a real connection. "Gabriel," she began softly, lifting her gaze from the journal. "These records show so much pain and sacrifice. It's as if everyone here was bound to a destiny they themselves didn't choose." He sighed, looking out the window, where the filtered light through the curtains cast a soft glow in the room. "That's the fate of those who carry a name, Marina. The house of Ornatos has always been a place of sacrifice. My grandfather used to say that no one here is free, that we're all part of a greater legacy." He paused, and Marina sensed the bitterness in his tone. "I grew up hearing that. Since I was young, I was taught to honor this house and accept that my fate was already decided." Marina watched Gabriel for a moment, seeing in his eyes the depth of a conflict he'd been carrying for years. She knew he was beginning to trust her, even if reluctantly, and she felt this was her chance to encourage him to see things in a new way. "Maybe your grandfather was wrong." She spoke with a tone that was firm yet understanding. "Sometimes, those who came before us cling to ideas that limit us, Gabriel. Maybe what you need is someone who can help you see beyond this destiny they keep trying to impose on you." He looked at her, clearly surprised by the boldness of her words. For a second, a slight smile touched his lips, but he quickly returned to his serious expression. "And who would that be, Marina? Someone willing to risk everything? You?" He looked at her intensely, as if he wanted to know how far she was willing to go. Marina held his gaze, feeling that this was the moment to show him her determination. "Maybe I am that person, Gabriel. Or maybe it's you yourself. It doesn't matter who takes the first step. What matters is that you understand you have the power to choose what you want, regardless of what tradition imposes." He continued to stare at her, and Marina saw her words were having an impact. Although he tried to maintain his rigid stance, she could see that an internal struggle was unfolding within Gabriel. He wanted to break free, yet he was still a prisoner of his own fears and the expectations of a family that had long defined his destiny. After a long silence, Gabriel stood and walked to a higher shelf, pulling out an album of old photos. Marina noticed the hesitation in his movements, but she also saw he seemed determined to show her something. "These are some of the few photos left from my childhood here," he said with a nostalgic tone. "When my mother was still alive, this place was different." He leafed through the album, and Marina leaned in to see the black and white images. In the photos, a very young Gabriel appeared, smiling shyly, next to a woman with a gentle expression whom Marina recognized as his mother. The mansion looked more vibrant, filled with flowers and with sunlight streaming through the windows. After she was gone, everything changed, he continued, his voice low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. My grandfather took over and made sure to erase every trace of the freedom and life she tried to bring here. Marina felt a shared sorrow as she listened to his story. Gabriel's mother, despite everything, seemed to have been someone who had tried to bring something humane to that house, something he was now searching for, even if unconsciously. She lightly touched his hand in a gesture of empathy, and Gabriel didn't pull away. He looked at her, and the hardness in his gaze softened a little. Your mother seemed like a special woman, Gabriel. Maybe that's the legacy you should really honor. What she tried to build, not what your grandfather destroyed. Gabriel took a deep breath, absorbing her words, and for a moment, the mask of arrogance and resistance he wore so tightly seemed to fall away. It was as if, for the first time, he was beginning to consider the idea that he could honor the past in a way that didn't trap him. He closed the album and looked at Marina with a restrained expression of gratitude. I think you're the first person to talk to me like this, he said with a slight smile. I don't know if I'm ready to see things the way you do, but thank you for trying. Marina smiled, sensing that this was a significant breakthrough. For the first time, Gabriel had allowed himself to hear something that went against everything he had always believed. They were building a quiet trust, made of subtle gestures and words that were finally starting to break down the barriers between them. Sensing he was more receptive, Marina decided to share something personal. I also know what it's like to lose someone we love, she said softly. And, just like you, I was raised to believe my place was already decided. I thought my life would never change until I lost everything and was forced to find a new path. Maybe that's why I'm here. Gabriel observed her intently, and Marina felt that her words were creating an even deeper connection between them. They were united by pain, by the struggles they'd both faced to free themselves from the chains that bound them. Maybe there's more in common between us than I thought, he murmured, almost to himself, before standing. I think the House of Ornato still has many secrets, Marina. And if you're willing to continue, maybe together we can uncover something even I didn't know. Marina nodded, sensing that, for the first time, Gabriel truly wanted her help. The barrier between them was breaking down, and they both knew this shared journey might lead to discoveries that could change their lives. As they walked together through the mansion's corridors, the heavy atmosphere felt less oppressive. Gabriel, though still hesitant, was beginning to allow himself to trust Marina. And for the first time, he felt that perhaps, with her by his side, he could face the weight of his own history and find a path to the freedom he so desired. A cold, quiet morning dawned in Velmor, and the Ornato mansion seemed even more steeped in mystery, shrouded in a dense mist that barely let any sunlight through. Marina was in the library, leafing through the old journals, when Gabriel entered the room, looking more serious and introspective than usual. She watched him for a moment, sensing something was different. Gabriel, who usually got straight to the point or kept his distance, seemed hesitant, as if he was weighing something important. He crossed the room, stopping in front of one of the large windows and looking out at the garden, where wild, untamed plants sprawled in every direction. Finally, he broke the silence. I've been thinking about this mansion, he said, still not looking directly at Marina. About what it means and what I really want to do with it. Marina's heart quickened at his statement. She knew Gabriel was conflicted about his past and the memories the mansion held, but she hadn't imagined he was on the verge of making a definitive decision. She closed the book in her hands and waited, her expression serious. And what exactly do you mean by that, Gabriel? She asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. He took a deep breath before answering, his voice laced with hesitation. I'm considering selling the mansion. His words were firm, but there was a note of doubt in his voice, as though he was still searching for justifications for himself. Marina felt a chill run down her spine. The thought of selling the mansion seemed almost like a betrayal of everything it represented, not just to the Ornatos but to the journey of discovery they had embarked on together. She tried to contain her indignation, but she couldn't hide the shock from her face entirely. Sell it? She repeated incredulously. After everything we've discovered here, after all the stories, the letters, you just want to get rid of it? Gabriel turned to face her, and Marina noted the uncertainty in his expression, despite his attempt to maintain a firm stance. Marina, this mansion, for me, it's a burden, a weight I never wanted to carry. Yes, there are stories here, but there are also hurts, secrets, and shadows I'd rather leave behind. I believe it might be better to start fresh, somewhere else. Marina felt a mix of sadness and anger rise within her. The House of Ornatos was more than just an old building. It held memories, legacies, and represented the struggles of multiple generations. To dispose of the mansion felt, to her, like erasing all those stories, burying the most precious parts of that place. "So you'd rather destroy everything, Gabriel?" she said firmly. "You'd rather pretend none of this matters? That all these secrets and memories are just shadows you can erase with a signature?" Gabriel looked at her with a puzzled expression, as if trying to understand the intensity of her reaction. "Maybe you're getting too involved, Marina." He shook his head, a hint of frustration in his voice. "I'm not like you. I don't see this house as a refuge of precious memories. For me, it's a prison, a constant reminder of everything I've lost." Marina crossed her arms, feeling her emotions bubbling to the surface. "I don't believe you're that insensitive, Gabriel. This house isn't just yours. It belongs to everyone who came before you and to all the stories that lived here. Don't you see the value in that?" Gabriel narrowed his eyes, his face taking on a look of irritation she rarely saw. He seemed to be wrestling with an internal conflict, as though he wanted to rid himself of the burden but couldn't ignore Marina's words. "Value?" he scoffed bitterly. "Since when does a place full of dusty walls and old furniture have value? Maybe you're idealizing this too much, Marina. Do you think you're going to salvage all the memories I'd prefer to keep buried?" Marina didn't back down. She was determined to make him see that the mansion was more than just a building. "I think you're afraid to face the history, Gabriel," she said in a low, firm voice. "You keep talking about burdens, but maybe this house is just trying to show you that you still have a choice. Selling it won't erase what you've been through, but understanding its value might actually free you." He fell silent, and Marina saw that her words had touched him, even if he resisted showing it. Gabriel seemed to struggle with something inside, torn between the desire to leave the past behind and the thought that, perhaps, honoring the mansion was the only way to find peace. After a few seconds, he sighed and looked away. "Maybe I really don't see things the way you do, Marina. To me, this house is a burden, a constant reminder of everything that was lost." He paused as though searching for the right words. "But I admit that sometimes I wonder if there's any value in trying to understand what all of this means." Marina sensed a small opening in his statement. He wasn't convinced, but at least he was willing to question his own decision. "Look around, Gabriel." She gestured to the shelves full of books, the portraits on the walls, and the furniture that, though old and dusty, still held the marks of the past. "Everything here tells a story. If you sell this house, you'll be destroying more than just a building. You'll be erasing the memories of those who came before you and the lessons that could be learned." He looked at her with an uncertain expression, but Marina noticed something new in his eyes, a kind of doubt he seemed reluctant to admit. "Do you really think this house deserves to be preserved?" he asked, his tone a mix of skepticism and curiosity. "Do you think there's any value in carrying this legacy?" Marina nodded, her voice filled with conviction. "I believe that sometimes, what we call a burden is actually an opportunity to reclaim what's most human in us, Gabriel. Your mother tried to keep this place as a home, and if you truly want to honor what she represented, maybe it's time to see the mansion as she would have." Gabriel remained silent, processing Marina's words. She knew he wasn't ready to fully abandon the idea of selling the mansion, but she saw that he was starting to consider the possibility of preserving it. After a few moments, he gave a slight smile, more ironic than genuine, but Marina knew it was a sign of progress. "I'll think about it, Marina," he said in a tone that didn't fully reveal his intentions. "But don't expect me to change my mind so easily." Marina smiled back, sensing that despite his resistance, she was leaving a mark. She knew Gabriel needed time to understand everything the mansion meant, and that somehow he needed this confrontation to begin seeing the place with new eyes. As he left the room, she returned to leafing through the old journals, hopeful that, eventually, Gabriel would recognize that the House of Ornatos was more than just a property. It was a legacy, and he, with all his complexity and pain, was part of that legacy, whether he accepted it or not. The day was cold and cloudy, and the Ornato mansion seemed even more somber under the faint, diffused light filtering through the dusty windows. Marina walked through the silent corridors, each step echoing through the empty house, as if she were the only one breathing life into that place full of shadows and secrets. Since the last confrontation about selling the mansion, Gabriel had kept his distance, as if reflecting on Marina's words. She knew he needed time, but her restlessness only grew. Still absorbed in thought, she entered one of the smaller rooms she hadn't explored yet. The furniture was covered with dusty sheets, and the air was filled with the smell of old memories, mixing dust with a faint hint of something that had once been sweet, maybe lavender. Feeling an inexplicable urge, Marina walked over to a small desk in the corner of the room, where a half-open drawer caught her attention. She opened the drawer slowly, revealing a collection of papers and letters carefully stacked. The paper was yellowed with age, and the edges were worn, as if someone had handled them many times before tucking them away. Marina picked up the letters carefully, sensing the weight of what these words might mean to Gabriel, and to the mystery surrounding his family. As she opened the first letter, she saw it was written by Gabriel's mother, in a delicate, intimate, almost melancholic handwriting. The letter seemed to be addressed to a friend or close relative, someone she sought for comfort and understanding. Velmor, January 8, 1986. Dear Lucia, there are days when I feel like a stranger in this house. I, who once was part of it, now feel like a shadow, someone tolerated out of convenience, but never truly accepted. Gabriel is my only anchor, the only reason I remain here. But I fear for his future. The family expects him to follow in his father's footsteps, to cling to this cruel tradition that erases any possibility of choice. My hope is that one day he understands he doesn't need to bear this burden alone, that he can be more than just an Ornato. But with so many expectations and pressures, I'm not sure he'll have the strength to see beyond these walls. Your friend, Anna. Marina read the words with a heavy heart. She could feel Anna's anguish and concern, a woman who, despite living in the mansion, had never truly belonged there. The tone of the letter was sad but filled with love. Anna didn't want Gabriel to be simply an Ornato, she wanted him to be free to make his own choices. Lost in thought, Marina continued reading the other letters, finding a pattern in all of them. Gabriel's mother seemed to sense the burden he would one day carry and, in some way, feared he'd never be able to free himself from it. After a while, Gabriel entered the room. He observed her silently, his face hardened, but his eyes showing a certain curiosity. "What are you doing?" he asked, with a tone that was a mix of distrust and interest. Marina looked up at him for a moment before responding. She decided now was the time to share what she had found. "These are letters from your mother, Gabriel. I found them here, stored away, and I think you should read some of them." She held out the letter to him, but Gabriel hesitated, as if he was afraid of what those words might bring up. "Letters from her?" he murmured, a look of pain in his eyes. "I didn't know she wrote letters, and if she did, why would she keep them? Or rather, why didn't anyone tell me about this?" Marina stayed firm, sensing the importance of helping him confront the past. "Maybe she kept these words for you to find at the right time, Gabriel. Maybe she knew that one day you would need them to understand what being here truly means." Gabriel took the letter with trembling hands and began to read it in silence. As he absorbed the words, his face became a blend of sadness and understanding, as though he was finally seeing something he had long avoided facing. "My hope is that one day he understands he doesn't need to bear this burden alone." He repeated the words softly, almost as if he were speaking to himself. The sadness in his tone made Marina realize that these words were, indeed, starting to affect him. She knew it was difficult for him to admit, but Gabriel carried the weight of his family's expectations and legacy in a way that didn't allow him to be himself. "My mother, she was always a woman who saw the world differently. I never understood why she seemed so out of place here," he said finally, his voice trembling. "But now I understand. She never wanted me to become a prisoner of this place, and yet I never managed to see myself outside this mansion. Marina stepped closer, determined to offer the support he so clearly needed. Maybe this is your chance to finally understand what she wanted for you, Gabriel. Maybe honoring her memory means seeing the mansion through her eyes, with the desire for freedom that she tried to teach you. He looked away, as if Marina's words were difficult to process. Deep down, he knew his mother had always been someone special, someone who had loved him deeply and wanted a different life for him. But he also knew that the Ornato legacy was a difficult tie to break. I wish I could say I can do it, he said, his voice low and uncertain. But I don't know if I can step away from the destiny my family has set for me. Marina looked at him with understanding, realizing how entangled he was in these invisible chains. But at the same time, she knew that somehow, Gabriel was beginning to free himself from the weight of this past. In that moment, she felt that her presence there had a purpose, that maybe she was meant to help him see the world differently. No one said it would be easy, Gabriel, she replied encouragingly. But maybe you need to let yourself see things from a different perspective. Your mother didn't leave these letters to make you feel more trapped. She left them because she knew one day you'd have the strength to be free. He looked at her, and Marina saw a new spark in his eyes. She knew he still bore the weight of tradition and lineage, but now, at least, he was beginning to see that he had a choice. The strength of his mother, her words, and her wishes were there, present, like a beacon guiding him. As he left the room, Gabriel held the letter in his hands, and Marina sensed that, for the first time, he was beginning to understand what his mother had tried to teach him. This was the first step for him to finally embrace his own destiny, free from the impositions of family and the mansion. The house of Ornatos, with all its secrets and shadows, was beginning to reveal a side of hope and transformation, and Marina knew that together, they might find the true meaning of freedom. That night, the Ornato mansion was silent, with a heavy, somber atmosphere that seemed to reflect the conflicts simmering in Gabriel's heart. Marina was in the main hall, waiting for him, feeling that this was the right moment to confront him about the truths he was reluctant to accept. The revelations from the letters and the hints of doubt he had started to show suggested that Gabriel was finally beginning to understand the true meaning of his legacy. Gabriel entered the room, and Marina immediately noticed the tension and uncertainty on his face. He stood rigidly, attempting to display control, but his eyes betrayed the vulnerability he was trying to hide. "You wanted to talk to me?" he asked, his voice carrying a tone that seemed to challenge yet also showed a hint of hesitation. Marina nodded, taking a deep breath before beginning. "Yes, Gabriel. I think it's time for you to truly decide what you want to do with all of this," she said, her tone firm but not accusatory. "You keep talking about the burden of tradition and expectations, but you never seem willing to really confront what they mean." He frowned, and Marina could see the resistance in his eyes. Gabriel had always been defensive about his past and the obligations he believed he was forced to bear. She knew he was used to hiding behind justifications and his own pride. "And what exactly do you expect me to do, Marina?" he shot back, his tone slightly irritated. "Do you think I can just walk away from all of it? Abandon the lineage, the Ornato name, as if none of it matters?" Marina shook her head, remaining calm, though her voice was filled with conviction. "I'm not saying you should give it all up, Gabriel. I'm saying you need to decide if you're willing to live a life where every step is dictated by rules that were never your own. Freedom has a cost, but so does living without it." He let out a bitter laugh, crossing his arms and looking away. "Freedom? You talk about it like it's something simple. Maybe it's easy for you to see things that way, but this mansion and this legacy are part of me, whether I want them or not." Marina stepped a bit closer, keeping her gaze fixed on his face. Gabriel was avoiding direct confrontation, but she knew he was listening to every word, even if he tried to hide it. "So you'd rather spend your life bound to something you hate?" she challenged, her tone daring. "You'd rather marry someone you don't love, live in a place you despise, all just to honor a tradition that has already destroyed so many before you?" Gabriel looked at her with a fierce expression, and Marina saw that her words were striking deeply. She knew he had always tried to avoid any direct confrontation with his own feelings, but now it seemed he could no longer escape. "And who are you to tell me what I should or shouldn't do, Marina?" he replied, his voice hard but slightly trembling. "You're an outsider here, someone who barely knows my story. Don't you think you're overstepping?" Marina didn't back down. She knew she was challenging Gabriel in a way no one else had, and that he needed to hear these words, even if they were painful. "Maybe I am an outsider, but I'm willing to see things as they truly are," she responded firmly. "I'm willing to look at this place, the letters, the memories your mother left, and understand what really matters. And until you do the same, you're only running, Gabriel." He was silent for a moment, his face shifting between anger and confusion. Marina could see he was on the verge of an emotional explosion, as if each of her words were dismantling the walls he had carefully constructed. Gabriel had always been proud and reserved, but now it seemed something within him was close to breaking. "Running?" he repeated with a bitter laugh. "You think I'm running? Everything I've done so far has been to honor this house, this damned tradition. And here you are, trying to convince me I can simply escape?" Marina took a step forward, determined not to retreat. "Maybe honoring this house means more than being a prisoner to it, Gabriel. Maybe the true legacy of the Ornatos is something you haven't understood yet. Something that goes beyond these mansion walls and the rules you believe you need to follow." Gabriel looked at her, and for a moment, Marina saw a deep pain in his eyes, a pain he tried to hide but was now exposed. He seemed about to say something but hesitated, looking away once more. "My mother," he began, his voice low, almost a whisper. "She always wanted me to have a different life, but I never knew how to do that without destroying everything she built." Marina moved closer, her expression gentle yet determined. "Maybe what she really wanted was for you to have the courage to live for yourself, Gabriel. Maybe she knew that keeping up appearances and conventions wasn't enough to be happy. That's why she wrote those letters, so that one day you might see the real choice you have." Gabriel watched her with a vulnerable expression, and in that instant, Marina saw he was battling against a truth he had avoided for so long. He was torn between his desire for freedom and the weight of expectations he had always carried. "What if I'm wrong, Marina?" he asked, his voice breaking. "What if, in the end, all I do is lose what's left of her memory?" Marina held his hand, offering her support. "Maybe the only mistake would be to live a life that isn't yours, Gabriel. If your mother truly loved you, she'd understand that honoring her memory is more than just keeping a mansion. It's keeping alive the freedom she wanted for you." He fell silent, and Marina felt that he was finally open to considering her words. Gabriel, though still reluctant, was beginning to see that true freedom might lie beyond the walls of that mansion, beyond the conventions he had always believed were unbreakable. With a deep sigh, he finally nodded, as if accepting a truth he had long avoided. "Maybe you're right, Marina," he said, his expression weary but sincere. "Maybe it's time to look at this in a different way." Marina smiled, sensing this was the first step for Gabriel to finally begin crafting his own story, free from the weight of the past. As silence settled between them, Marina knew that together, they could transform the House of Ornatos into a symbol of freedom rather than oppression. And Gabriel was finally ready to consider that possibility. That night, the Ornato mansion was tranquil, with a silence that filled the corridors like a living presence, heavy with secrets and memories. Gabriel, after his intense confrontation with Marina, found himself alone in the study, surrounded by books and old mementos he had avoided facing honestly until now. Marina's words echoed in his mind, each one like a spark illuminating parts of his own story that he had tried to erase. He picked up one of the letters from his mother that Marina had found days before. Her handwriting was soft yet firm, and Gabriel could almost hear his mother's voice as he read the words she had written, filled with love and concern. The weight of what he was reading made him realize, for the first time, just how lonely and trapped he truly felt. "My hope is that you never feel like a prisoner, Gabriel, that you find your own way to honor this house and everything it represents. If ever you feel the burden is too heavy, remember that you don't have to carry it alone. Perhaps the true legacy of this house is to love, not merely to endure." His mother's words echoed in his heart, and Gabriel felt an emotion he hadn't experienced in a long time. It was as if she were there beside him, encouraging him to pursue a path he had never thought possible. He wondered how many times his mother had tried to convey this message to him and how many times, bound by his grandfather's rigid teachings, he had chosen to ignore her. Lost in thought, Gabriel heard soft footsteps behind him. When he turned, he saw Marina standing in the doorway, watching him with a look of understanding. She didn't say anything, but he knew her presence was a reminder that he was no longer alone, that someone was willing to support him. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. Gabriel nodded, though his expression still bore a deep sadness. He took a deep breath before responding. "Marina, for the first time, I think I'm beginning to understand what my mother truly wanted for me. But I also feel like I've failed her for so long." He lowered his gaze, his voice trembling. "Maybe I missed the chance to honor her memory the way she deserved." Marina moved closer, sitting beside him, and touched his hand with tenderness. "Gabriel, you didn't fail her. All the time you spent trying to be the perfect heir, trying to uphold this tradition, it's part of who you are. But that doesn't mean you can't honor her memory in a new way, in a way that's true to you." He remained silent, taking in her words. There was truth in what Marina was saying, but accepting that possibility was hard for him. Gabriel had spent years building a shield of duty and rigidity, and now, for the first time, he was considering the possibility of living beyond that facade. "I spent so much time trying to prove I was worthy of this name," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "And now I see my mother never wanted me to bear that weight. I think I've been fighting against what she truly wanted for me all along." Marina watched him with a gentle yet determined gaze. "Maybe it's time to let that fight go, Gabriel. To let the love your mother had for you matter more than the expectations tradition placed on you. If you want to honor her legacy, maybe you should start to see this mansion as she did." Gabriel lifted his gaze and looked at Marina's face. For the first time, he felt that someone truly understood him, someone who could see beyond his internal walls and see the vulnerable, wounded man he was. He felt an unexpected peace, a sense that maybe, at last, he could be who he truly wished to be. "And if I don't know how to do that?" he asked, his voice sincere, as if it was the most important question he'd ever asked. Marina smiled softly, holding his hand with more firmness. "Then start slowly. You don't have to change everything at once. Just allow yourself to see this house as a home, not an obligation. Let your mother's memories guide each step. And if you need someone by your side, I'll be here to help you." Her words resonated deeply, and Gabriel felt that something within him was finally beginning to break free. He looked around, taking in every detail of the study, the same place where his grandfather had taught him about the importance of honoring the Ornato name, about the sacrifices necessary to uphold the family's dignity. But now, these walls seemed different to him, as if there was a new possibility of turning this space into something welcoming and true. "I think I'm ready to try, Marina," he said sincerely, looking at her with gratitude. "Ready to see this place through new eyes, to honor what my mother truly wanted for me." Marina smiled, sensing this was a major step for Gabriel, and felt deeply grateful to be part of this transformative moment. She knew that, though the journey would be long, he was finally ready to begin a path of self-discovery and acceptance. As the night wore on, Marina and Gabriel spent hours talking, sharing family stories and reflecting on what it truly meant to belong to a place. For the first time, Gabriel allowed himself to laugh, to fondly remember moments from his childhood and even times he'd shared with his mother, memories he had avoided for so long, fearing that reliving them would bring pain. Now, with Marina by his side, he saw that these memories offered solace, a way to find peace amid the darkness of his past. The Ornato mansion felt lighter that night, as though the environment itself reflected the transformation Gabriel was beginning. Marina knew he would still face many doubts and that the journey was only beginning, but she also knew he was finally ready to embrace the possibility of a life that was his own and not just a shadow of his family's expectations. At the end of the night, Gabriel looked at Marina with a sincere smile, something she rarely saw on his face. For the first time, he seemed like a free man, even if that freedom was just a spark, a glimpse of something he was learning to build. "Thank you, Marina," he said softly, almost as if in a whisper. "Thank you for showing me it's possible to see things differently." She returned his smile, feeling a profound satisfaction at seeing Gabriel finally embrace his own story without the weight of the past. The sun rose slowly over Velmor, and the soft morning light flooded the corridors of the Ornato mansion, dispelling the shadows that had gathered overnight. Gabriel had been awake since early morning, sitting in his room, looking out the window as he reflected on the decision he knew he had to make. Marina's words, his mother's letters, and the memories he had avoided for so long were now in front of him, like pieces of a puzzle he was beginning to understand. After years of obedience to his family's conventions, Gabriel could finally see clearly what he needed to do. The arranged engagement, which he had once seen as an obligation, now felt like a prison. He knew that deciding to cancel the arrangement would cause discomfort and tension within the family, but he also knew it was the right choice. For the first time, he wanted something that was entirely his own. As the day took shape, he walked toward the library, where Marina was already organizing some of the old journals and documents they had found together. When she saw him enter, she sensed something was different. He walked in with a calm yet determined expression, and there was a strength in his eyes she hadn't seen before. "Marina," he began, his voice gentle but firm. "I've made a decision. I'm going to call off the engagement. There's no point in continuing with something that was never truly my choice." Marina felt a wave of emotion and admiration hearing those words. Gabriel was finally freeing himself from expectations and forging his own path. She knew the impact of his decision would be significant, but she also knew it was a vital step for him to live with authenticity. "I'm proud of you, Gabriel," she said with a tender smile. "That takes so much courage. And I'm sure your mother would be proud too." He nodded, a faint smile appearing on his face. For the first time, he felt that by honoring his mother's memory, he was also honoring himself. But he knew that the commitment he'd made with Marina went beyond his own freedom. The Ornato mansion, with all its history, also deserved a new purpose. "I want to restore this mansion, Marina," he continued, his voice filled with conviction. "I want to turn it into something new, something that honors the past but also offers a fresh beginning. And I want you to help me make that happen." Marina felt her heart race with that proposal. They had come a long way together, facing challenges and revelations, and now, finally, they were ready to build something born of their own choices. She knew the mansion's restoration would not be an easy task, but she also knew that, by Gabriel's side, she was willing to face any challenge. "I accept, Gabriel," she replied with a resolute smile. "Let's make this house a place that truly belongs to us, something that represents what we want to create together." They spent the rest of the day planning the first stages of the restoration. Marina suggested that each room be dedicated to a part of the family's history, preserving the memories they had uncovered throughout the corridors. Gabriel, in turn, proposed that the gardens be revitalized with flowers and trees his mother had once grown, so that the mansion would become a space that reflected the freedom and beauty she had always desired. As the days passed, they worked together, exploring every corner of the mansion, removing layers of dust and cobwebs, bringing life back to a place that had seemed condemned to be forgotten. Gabriel, who had once avoided emotional involvement, now devoted himself with passion and commitment, as though each stroke of the brush, each hammer strike, was a step toward his own redemption. The transformation of the mansion was not only physical, it reflected the inner change Gabriel was experiencing each day. He and Marina had started as rivals, but now they were partners, united by a shared purpose and a friendship that had overcome the barriers of the past. One afternoon, while they were in the garden, Gabriel paused, looking out at the horizon with a serene expression. Marina, beside him, noticed the brightness in his eyes and the slight smile on his face. "I never thought I could find peace in this place," he said, his voice contemplative. "But being here with someone who truly understands what it all means makes everything feel right." Marina smiled, feeling she was part of that journey of liberation and transformation. She knew that together, they had given the Ornato mansion a new purpose, one his mother would have wanted, and one that represented the freedom Gabriel had long sought. "I think this house needed us as much as we needed it," she said, gently holding his hand. "And finally, we're making it a home, not just a mansion." Gabriel nodded, feeling that, for the first time, he had found the true meaning of belonging somewhere. He had shed the burden of expectations, and now, alongside Marina, he was free to create something that was truly his. With the restoration underway, they began to open the mansion's doors to the community of Velmor, offering the space for events, gatherings, and exhibitions that celebrated local culture. Gabriel and Marina, bound by friendship and a commitment to preserve the past, became a warm and welcoming presence for everyone who visited the Ornato mansion. Each day, the mansion came alive, reflecting the strength of two people who, together, had found a path to freedom and redemption. Standing with Marina, Gabriel was finally able to look to the future with hope and gratitude. The autumn sun shone softly on the Ornato mansion, illuminating every detail of the renovated building, each preserved piece of history, and each flower that now graced the garden. Side by side, Gabriel and Marina admired the result of months of hard work, proud of what they had created together. The old building, which once seemed dark and abandoned, now exuded life and vibrancy, a haven that honored the past while embracing the future. It was a special day. Visitors filled the house, mostly residents of Velmor who had come to see the new space and celebrate its official reopening. Music played in the main hall, children laughed in the garden, and guests explored the corridors, admiring the restored rooms that told the story of the Ornato family. For the first time in many years, the mansion was filled with laughter and joy. Standing at the entrance, Gabriel watched each face, each detail, with a serene and satisfied expression. He still felt his mother's presence there, as if she, too, were pleased with what he and Marina had achieved. Beside him, Marina smiled, visibly moved, watching the reactions of those who, like her, felt the welcoming touch that now emanated from the place. "You did it, Gabriel," she said, holding his hand. "Your mother would be so proud. You've given this house a new purpose, something she always wanted for you." He looked at her, a sincere smile and bright eyes reflecting his emotions. "I think I could only do it because you were by my side, Marina," he said, taking a deep breath, each word carrying the weight of his past and the lightness of his present. "This house is as much yours as it is mine now. Without you, I would never have realized that the true legacy of the Ornatos was to create something more than a symbol of tradition." Marina nodded, feeling that what she and Gabriel had built was indeed a partnership based on respect, understanding, and a shared purpose. "And who knows, Gabriel," she said playfully, "maybe now I'm part of the Ornato tradition too. After all, the secrets and stories of this house have become a part of me." They laughed together, realizing that the friendship they had built was special and unique, a bond that went beyond any family ties. Every obstacle they had faced, every revelation and confrontation, had transformed the weight of the Ornato legacy into something lighter, a genuine connection that resonated not only with the past but also with the present and the future. Gabriel looked around, taking in every sound and every smiling face, feeling a peace he had not experienced in a long time. The Ornato mansion was no longer a burden. It was a space that he and Marina had transformed into a refuge for anyone who sought a home, a place to belong. "Marina, I've realized something," he said thoughtfully, happiness evident in his tone. "My mother always wanted me to find freedom, and now I understand that it also means allowing others to find that same freedom. This house is no longer just mine, nor just ours. It belongs to everyone who needs it." Marina nodded, sensing that they had truly completed what they had set out to do. Gabriel was finally free, not only from his family's expectations but from the emotional chains that had bound him. "I think the greatest lesson this house has taught me is that a true home is the one we build for ourselves," she said, her voice full of emotion. "And by creating something that's genuinely ours, we've found more than freedom. We've found a purpose." They stood in silence for a moment, sharing a mutual understanding and a deep sense of peace. The dark past of the Ornatos had finally been transformed, and the mansion was now a symbol of renewal, a space of warmth and hope. As evening fell over Velmor, and the lights of the Ornato mansion illuminated the grounds, Gabriel and Marina walked together through the gardens, observing the activity around them and feeling grateful for the path they had traveled together. They knew that, no matter what the future held, they would always have that place and that moment to remember as a milestone of their own transformation and of what they had built together. At the end of the night, When all the guests had left and the mansion had returned to silence, Gabriel and Marina exchanged a final smile, filled with pride and satisfaction for what they had accomplished. "Thank you, Marina," he said softly, his voice filled with gratitude, "for believing in me even when I didn't believe in myself. Without you, none of this would have been possible." She returned his smile, feeling that everything they had lived through together had been worth it. The Ornato mansion, once a symbol of oppression, was now the home they had both longed for. And they had finally found a place where they belonged, not out of obligation, but by choice. If you're enjoying this story and want to continue exploring the mysteries of Velmor, subscribe to the channel. This way, you don't miss any details of the next adventures and twists we have to tell. Join us and prepare for stories that will move and surprise you.